Coast are burning tonight in the largest wildfire in California.
Special broadcast, we will unpack the dangers of the wildfires and climate change, featuring expert interviews and the most up-to-date information on the flames. Good evening, everyone. I'm Max Sacco.
And I'm Danielle Koscik. We begin tonight's broadcast with a report from WRHU's Conor Donnelly about the current situation along the coast.
To flee their homes. The intensity of the blazes is raising questions about the impact of climate change and our role in those changes. Experts say human impact on the environment is contributing to the hazardous fire conditions, as well as causing other dangerous conditions around the country. Though wildfires are not uncommon in California, they have drastically increased in intensity over the last few years, with the 2018 season killing over 100 people. But this year, 3 of the largest fires in California history are burning at once. With 2 months still left in the West Coast fire season, this year could be the worst on record for the state. Over 3 million acres have been scorched so far, from just north of the Mexico border all the way through Washington. In Oregon, at least 5 entire towns have been destroyed by the over 30 fires being battled there, and over 10% of the state's population has been forced to evacuate so far. Even beyond the inferno's reach, its effects can be felt far and wide. In San Francisco, an eerie red sky blanketed the city, caused by billowing plumes of smoke hanging in the air. The same smoke is causing air quality advisories throughout the region, reaching as far as Nevada. Firefighters from as far away as Texas are making their way to California to help contain the blazes. The state is once again employing hundreds of inmates from their correctional systems as additional reinforcements for their firefighting efforts. A dry winter combined with millions of dead trees from the state's historic drought have created vulnerable conditions for wildfires. California Governor Gavin Newsom has at least partially laid the blame on climate change, and many experts are inclined to agree. The director of the Berkeley Atmospheric Science Center, David Romps, says climate change contributed to the likelihood of fires starting, the heat at which they burn, and their difficulty to battle. Hofstra Professor of Geology, Environment, and Sustainability, Jace Bernhardt, says warming weather can lead to more favorable conditions for fires to start.
Through the years, we've been seeing and are expected to continue to see more favorable sort of fire weather days, so more opportunities to have fires potentially starting and out in the western U.S. And that sort of goes along with the observation that we've been seeing. Fires generally like warmer and drier conditions in the western U.S. Large swaths of it have been generally warming like the rest of the globe, but also drying out.
Climate change has become a growing concern for both scientists and policymakers, as the effect becomes more real for the average American. The problem isn't just limited to fires in the West Coast, as the same changes could be making the Gulf and Northeast more prone to violent storms.
Certainly there's some evidence that we're seeing more of the extreme storms, and in the future we could see a bit more of those high-end, very strong hurricanes, like the categories 3, 4, and 5, the so-called major hurricanes. And in the last few years, we've certainly seen several of them.
It could be that these fires are a symptom of a greater problem, and if nothing is done, then something even worse may be yet to come. Wildfires continue to rage along the West Coast, killing dozens, devastating
Let's
towns,
take a look at where we
hundreds of
stand on the
thousands
magnitude of these wildfires. California Fire Information Officer Christine McMurrow says that more than 2.8 million acres of land have been on fire since the middle of August. This is the same amount of land as 190 Manhattans.
At least 700,000 people have been told to evacuate the region. More than 30 people have died as a result of these wildfires, and dozens more are missing. Roughly 20% of the fires in California and Oregon have been contained.
Coming up after the break, we have an interview with a Hofstra student from California speaking about how his family has been affected by these fires. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Wildfire and Climate Change Special, only on 88.7 FM, Radio Hofstra University. I'm your host, Danielle Koscik.
And I'm Max Sacco. As wildfires burn along the west coast, thousands of people have been forced to evacuate their communities. WRHU reporter Crystal Bermudez spoke with the Hofstra students from California whose families had to evacuate due to the fires.
About the wildfires that are going on in California right now. And as you know, the wildfires have been affecting parts of California since the start of 2020. So my question to you is, how have wildfires affected you personally and your community, of course?
Well, I'm lucky enough to be able to say that my town at least hasn't been burned, but we are experiencing heavy smoke that comes in from the fires that are around us, and then just a constant haze, kind of making the sky all gray. There's like red in the sky when the sun's setting and stuff like that. So it's just kind of like a apocalyptic scene almost sometimes.
And can you tell if there's a difference with how the air feels like or how the temperatures are like when you're in California?
Definitely. Yeah, this is also the hottest year on record for California. So, where I live, and my parents live, it's 110 degrees almost every day there at its peak, and then it comes down. Sometimes it fluctuates, but it really gets up there, and it's still getting up there this late into September, which is not a good sign for the wildfires that are still to come, possibly.
Right. And what steps have been taken in your community to help with the wildfires? I know your community hasn't been impacted as much as other towns in California, but are there any precautionary steps that they might be taking right now to prepare just in case a wildfire does hit your town?
I'm not super up to date with what's happening like right now in my county. I know they've got firefighters. I have a friend from high school who's a firefighter. And I know that they're doing stuff with with like tractors and stuff in dry fields. That's where a lot of these fires are starting. There's these dry fields, or maybe they'll strike a tree, and then they'll spread into a dry field, which is where a lot of the growth of the fire actually comes from. So they like basically like take a tractor and basically take out a lot of that like dead dry weed that's there, so that it can't catch, and there's only dirt there to kind of like create like a fire stop.
Are these tractors working every day, or is it during the weekends? Like, how frequently are these tractors going into these dry fields?
As far as I know, this is a community effort. This has nothing to do with local government or anything like that. It's personally owned tractors that are doing this, or rented tractors. So there's and so I'm not even sure the extent to what this is going on, but it's probably not that much.
Awesome. So it's more so the community coming together and finding ways to prevent more wildfires.
Yeah, basically.
And what are the concerns people most express about when dealing with these wildfires, whether it's, even though it's not in your town, but like what are some things people are more worried about, or if you know anyone that, has experienced dealing with this wildfire right now?
Well, definitely like the people in the areas where the fire is being affected, getting evacuated. I've luckily never had to do that in all my years in California. But I'd imagine that is very scary to be evacuated. So that's definitely a worry, because once you're evacuated, you don't know what's going to happen to your house. It could burn down, it could get lucky. And then, for my community personally, there's a lot of air quality concerns. So we're very high on the index. I just saw it yesterday. We're in, very bad air quality. So it's recommended you don't go outside. And also with this fire danger, we have to take, this is also another common complaint, we have to keep our homes pretty heated because we don't want to use too much electricity. to where it could cause other fires, because our power company has been known to create other fires in the past.
What company exactly is it? Is it like PSCNG?
So it's called PG&E, and back in 2018, there was a settlement, or basically a trial came to a conclusion that PG&E was responsible for the Butte County fires, so the Camp Fire, which completely destroyed the town of Paradise, California. So that's what's kind of different about this year is PG&E has done a really good job managing their stuff, but this is actually a natural disaster. A lot of this was actually sparked from a thunderstorm.
Oh, wow. So rather than it being the company's fault this time, it's more so something with nature that it just has to go through its own course.
Kind of, but this was more of a unnatural storm, probably the cause of global warming. It was a storm that traveled up from the tropics and hit very high in California, which it really never happens. Like the part where I live in California, San Francisco Bay Area, doesn't have too many thunderstorms like that, and the thunder was widespread, and it created dozens of fires over the 2 nights that it happened. And there was rain and stuff, but that did nothing. If not, it could have actually helped those fires grow, that rain. So there was a lot of stuff that was just unnatural, yet like natural disaster like in this scenario.
Wow. And my last question to you is, how has the fire department in your town or in nearby areas been handling the wildfires? Since I'm sure many of them are at risk when dealing with these fires and trying to find ways to put them out.
I'm quite frankly not sure. I'd imagine they're having a very tough time because they're probably dispatched out to other places where there are fires, and there's very few here or back in the back where I live. So they're probably working very long shifts, multiple days, and then they have multiple days off, but they're constantly working to put out these fires. And I know they've called in stuff from out of state and out of the country, like firefighters to come and help, because unfortunately these fires, while California's has a lot of land burned, these fires are not just in California. There's Oregon, Washington, Arizona, Utah, Idaho. A lot of these places are also beginning to get some burns. So there's a lot of help needed from basically everywhere.
Well, thank you so much, Matt, for answering these questions. Again, I'm hoping that your family and your community are going to stay safe during this time. So I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time out of your day today to talk with me about the wildfires that are going on in California right now. And as you know, the wildfires have been affecting parts of California since the start of 2020. So my question to you is, how have wildfires affected you personally and your community, of course?
Well, I'm lucky enough to be able to say that my town at least hasn't been burned, but we are experiencing heavy smoke that comes in from the fires that are around us, and then just a constant haze, kind of making the sky all gray. There's like red in the sky when the sun's setting and stuff like that. So it's just kind of like a apocalyptic scene almost sometimes.
And can you tell if there's a difference with how the air feels like or how the temperatures are like when you're in California?
Definitely. Yeah, this is also the hottest year on record for California. So, where I live, and my parents live, it's 110 degrees almost every day there at its peak, and then it comes down. Sometimes it fluctuates, but it really gets up there, and it's still getting up there this late into September, which is not a good sign for the wildfires that are still to come, possibly.
Right. And
An exclusive interview with climate scientist Zeke Housefather about the devastating impacts of climate change.
impacted as much as other towns in California, but are there any precautionary steps that they might be taking right now?
California Governor Gavin Newsom met with President Trump earlier this week to discuss the effects of the fire and the effects on climate change. Even though the president allegedly refused to acknowledge the effect climate change had on the crisis, Newsom was adamant to get the point across. In a recent published article, Newsom said, "I will continue to be stubborn as I imagine. He will be as well. It's not a belief system, it's data," he said. "Science, you have to acknowledge the facts." The American Farm Bureau Federation is asking for additional resources, and in a letter to Senate leadership, the group advocates for the Emergency Wildfire and Public Safety Act.
The act would help to speed up forest management and post-fire reforestation and have dangerous wood removed from forests. Parts of the San Francisco area are finally seeing blue skies, and it is not being taken for granted, the office tweeted. In Oregon, a federal disaster declaration has been approved for the state to help fund the state's recovery.
Oregon's congressional leadership has also asked Health and Human Service Secretary Alex Azar to declare the wildfires in Oregon a public health emergency. Oregon Representative Peter DeFazio remarked that this decision will make for more federal aid available to the state and provide the resources needed for communities to rebuild.
As climate change becomes an ever-growing issue, it is important to identify the causes of the climate crisis and the action that needs to be taken. WRHU reporter Natalie Khait spoke to climate scientist Zeke Housefather from the Breakthrough Institute and research dedicated to environmental solutions.
Reporting for WRHU News, joined today by Zeke Housefather, a climate scientist and energy systems analyst whose research focuses on observational temperature records and climate models. Zeke, thank you so much for joining me today.
No worries, it's great to be on.
So just to start off, what is your experience studying the climate crisis?
So it's certainly come home in a very personal way this year. You know, oftentimes the climate seems like a very abstract thing, a problem that happens over decades, that, you know, will affect our children and our grandchildren. But living in California this year, it's really come home that it's something that's affecting me personally. My mother-in-law is actually staying with us right now because her house was in Talent, Oregon, where the catastrophic wildfires happened. And well, thankfully her house is okay, though much of her neighborhood burnt down. She doesn't have any power or water. Last week the skies above us were orange for a day, and today is the first day in almost a month that we've had air quality outside that's suitable to really breathe. So I'm making the most of it, as you can see. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting time to be a climate scientist.
And what has your research shown about rising temperatures?
So the globe as a whole has risen by about 1.2 degrees centigrade, or about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, since pre-industrial times. So most of that warming happening since the 1970s. And the land areas in general are warming about 40% faster than the oceans. So land area has risen on average about 1.5, 1.6 degrees centigrade. We expect that in a world of current policies enacted by countries, we'll probably end up with about 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. So that could be a bit lower or a lot higher, depending on some of these big uncertainties in the climate system around how sensitive the climate is to our emissions.
And how do wildfires and climate change reinforce each other?
So wildfires can spread much faster and more easily when the vegetation is dry. And there's something we call the vapor pressure deficit, which is essentially the difference between the amount of water vapor in the air and the amount that it could theoretically hold. And as temperatures go up, the water vapor pressure deficit also goes up. It's important when we talk about climate change and wildfires to emphasize that there's not much evidence that it's causing more fires per se. Things aren't getting so hot that they spontaneously combust, but rather when fires do occur, they're spreading more widely and becoming much larger. So in California, for example, we actually have slightly fewer fires overall today than we had in the 1980s, but the fires we do have burn about 5 times more area on average. And so in many ways, what we're seeing is less of an ignition problem than a condition problem. The drier vegetation, the buildup of fuel in forests due to our success in putting out wildfires for much of the last century have combined to create conditions that are very ripe for catastrophic wildfires.
And what are some of the potential long-term effects of the wildfires and the climate crisis?
So there's a lot of different effects. Certainly it's going to make places like California less attractive to live in the future. And if you're in an area that has a lot of forest land, like where I live right now, there's certainly an increased risk that your home might burn down. The air pollution we've been seeing, which is directly attributable to these fires, has pretty severe negative health impacts, particularly if it becomes a long-term thing. And we're sort of in a new normal, so to speak, around wildfires. We've seen catastrophic wildfires, almost every year for the last 5 years. And while some years we might get lucky, like last year, and have relatively few areas burned, it seems like conditions are going to be ripe for the foreseeable future for these sort of mega fires to happen in California and the Western U.S. more broadly. Climate change has many, many impacts besides just making conditions more suitable for big fires. Climate change is melting our polar ice caps. It's melting a lot of landlocked ice in glaciers, which is causing sea levels to rise, which risks flooding in coastal areas. What we're seeing is as the climate warms, we tend to get more water vapor in the atmosphere on average in general. And so what that means is that when we have storms, we tend to have heavier rainfall. So what we're seeing with the hurricane, for example, in the Gulf right now, we've seen a large increase in these sort of extreme rainfall events from hurricanes. And that's something consistent with what we expect to happen in a warmer world. And then climate change, threatens crops from extreme heat events. It threatens people's health, and it threatens a lot of the natural world. A lot of plant and animal species are adapted to live in fairly narrow climate ranges. And in many cases, we're changing the climate faster than animal and plant species can adapt, either by moving to new climate zones or by evolving to be able to sustain higher temperatures. And so there's a real risk that we could drive many of the world's species to extinction in a world where we don't take significant action to mitigate climate change and reduce our emissions.
And what actions can slow or stop the climate crisis in both short and long term?
So there's a lot of things that we can do to combat global warming and climate change more broadly. Most of our emissions come from energy in one way or another. The gasoline we burn in our cars, the coal that's burned by our power plants, the natural gas we burn in our homes to heat and cool them, or fuel oil, I suppose, in Long Island. And we can change the way we use energy. We can use heat pumps that use electricity produced by renewable or clean energy sources instead of burning fuel oil. We can drive electric vehicles instead of vehicles that burn gasoline. And we can replace our coal plants with things like wind turbines, solar panels, nuclear reactors, technologies that produce energy without producing greenhouse gases that warm the climate. There's also a fair amount of emissions that come from agriculture, and that's a trickier sector to deal with. There is certainly a role for dietary changes. People eating less red meat in particular can help reduce emissions. And more broadly, there's only so much that we as individuals can do, though individual action is important. But at the end of the day, we need policy, both from state and federal entities, that can shift the way we produce energy at a very large scale and shift the way we use energy. And things like subsidizing clean energy or mandating clean energy, making electric vehicles cheaper and more affordable to people, and spending a lot of money on innovation. Because while we have a lot of technologies to solve this problem, there are some sectors of the economy that are still tough to deal with, and more innovation and more technological advancement in those spaces are important. Particularly when we start talking about getting the rest of the world to reduce its emissions too, because our emissions of greenhouse gases don't stop at our national borders. The whole world contributes to this problem. And if we want to be able to convince, countries like China and India and emerging countries coming out of poverty in places like Africa, to not follow in our footsteps and, emit a ton of carbon dioxide, but rather to embrace clean energy sources, we really need to make those clean energy sources cheap.
And do you think climate denial is dangerous, and why?
I certainly think that, at this point, denying the basic reality of climate change is dangerous. There's an enormous scientific consensus on this issue. 98% or so, 97% of publishing climate scientists agree that climate change is real and human caused. And sort of listening to people who say climate change isn't real is like listening to people who say masks don't work to prevent the spread of COVID. You can always find someone out there who says it, but they're usually fringe voices and they shouldn't be affecting our policy. That said, outside of the basic physics of climate change, there are real areas of uncertainty and real areas of disagreement. There's people who think we need more solar and wind, and other people who think we need more nuclear. There's people who think that, in the short term, natural gas might have a role, or carbon capture and storage could help use some fossil energy going forward, and people who reject that. And so, while we should criticize people who are denying basic physics, we also need to recognize that there is a wide range of views on how best to solve these problems.
And obviously, like you said earlier, you are in California and I'm here in New York, and we're a New York-based radio station. Why should some of our listeners care about the fires that are happening that are thousands of miles away?
There's a few reasons. One is obviously human suffering is bad no matter where it happens. But also, this week our smoke came over to visit you guys as well, albeit higher up in the atmosphere. What happens in California affects conditions in New York as well. And the burning of these forests is also releasing a lot of carbon dioxide, which is itself a greenhouse gas and contributing to global warming that, you're experiencing in New York, just like we're experiencing in California.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Zeke, for taking the time to sit down with me and discuss a topic such as serious as climate change.
Our thanks to Natalie for that report. After the break, we'll hear from Vice President of the Portland Firefighters Association about what it's like on the ground in Oregon. Stay tuned.
The raging fires have had a deep impact on California's wildlife. According to published reports, the fires have basically wiped out critical populations of endangered species and incinerated native habitats. Experts say this may take years to recover. Wildlife officials believe the damage done not only by the fires, but climate change could worsen and recovery practically impossible. In a recent interview with the New York Times, Davia Palmieri of Oregon's Department of Fish and Wildlife said it's important to connect what's happening now and climate change. In Washington, fires destroyed critical breeding grounds of endangered sag grouse and sharp-tailed grouse. It is estimated that 30 to 70% of birds have been wiped out.
Pygmy rabbits were killed in Washington by the fires. In Oregon, the northern spotted owl and weasel no longer have homes. Their mountain forest living space burnt by the fires. In California, for the first time in history, the Department of Fish and Wildlife closed all sites as a safety precaution. In Oregon, the fires have largely raged in western pine forests, prompting different concerns. Several endangered and threatened species, including the northern spotted owl and the weasel-like pine marten, depend on the mature mountain forest that bore the brunt of the fires.
In other parts of the West, smoke from the fires could be the reason why many birds have been found dead. Reports of mass bird deaths have been blamed on the wildfires. According to a recent Forbes article, places like New Mexico and Arizona have seen strange numbers of birds dying.
While thousands of lives have been uprooted as a result of these fires, state and federal rescue resources have been stretched thin. WRHU reporter Rachel Luscher spoke with the vice president of the Portland Firefighter Association, Isaac McLennan, about what first responders are facing on the ground.
Welcome back to WRHU for our special coverage of the wildfires on the West Coast. I'm joined by Isaac McLennan. He's Vice President of the Oregon State Firefighters Council. Isaac, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So starting off, Oregon is seeing some of the worst fires in the state's history. I think in the past decade, about 500,000 acres of land burned, but you've seen 1 million acres of land burned in just a week. Can you talk about the magnitude of what you're dealing with?
Well, this, like you just said, I think those numbers almost kind of speak for themselves, but having lived here in Oregon my entire life, 40 plus years, I have never seen anything like this. And I became a firefighter at a pretty young age. I was a cadet firefighter at 17 years old. And so I entered the fire service very young, and sort of I've been engaged in that community for a long, long time. And in my entire life, I've never seen anything quite like this. Basically what you have is wildfires up and down from the very northern border to the southern border of Oregon that kind of all kind of are happening on the Cascade Mountain range. And you have, basically about 10 major fires. Even one of these fires would be enough to strip our resources in the state, let alone 10 major fires. And of course, there's other small ones that are either growing or have been contained that are still burning actively. But these are just devastating, these communities out here. You have entire communities that this fire just ran through with little to no warning.
You're also dealing with arson and climate change. So what's the game plan to control these fires?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question for a person who's like in my role, who's a firefighter and also involved in the Oregon State Firefighters Council. Obviously, that's something that we're heavily engaged in, but it's got to be a long-term plan, and we have to have a lot of stakeholders all come to the table to come up with the way in which we're going to deal with climate change and how that affects firefighting in the state of Oregon and along the up and down the West Coast. I think in the short term, before you come up with those, the first thing you have to do is you have to have the number of firefighters there to protect people's families and their homes. That's the thing that our jobs are to do right now. And it's that doesn't take a big plan. It just requires a little bit more funding to hire people to do that. Now, what you have in this situation right now is we have about 3,500 firefighters, professional firefighters in Oregon. Now, those are firefighters that sit in fire stations in communities across Oregon, from the coast to the high desert and up and down the Willamette Valley. That's where we have most of our population. And then, of course, in Portland, Oregon, where I live. And those firefighters essentially work 3 shifts. So they work a 24-hour shift on, and then they have a 48-hour shift off. That's generally speaking the way it works. What you had in these last week or so is you have firefighters basically working 48 hours and then having 24 hours off. You're working at instead of 1/3 of our workforce being working at any given time, you're having 2/3 of our workforce being worked at any time, and that's pretty unsustainable. You can imagine firefighters are going to get exhausted pretty quickly having to work those kind of schedules. So what we need in the short term to figure out how are we going to staff during these times when what these things are affecting our forests and ultimately our houses and neighborhoods.
And before stepping into your role as vice president, you were a firefighter for over 2 decades. What made you want to enter that field of work?
Yeah, so I'm actually still a firefighter. I ride on a truck in Portland, and so I still do that work every third day. In addition to that, I've taken on a leadership role in our firefighters association, both in my local in the Portland Firefighters Association, and also in the Oregon State Firefighters Council. What I see, my calling to that has been really because I care about firefighters and their families, and I saw the role as a union leader as a way in which I can care for those communities which I have grown to love and be a part of. It's a tall order because it's a lot of work with basically little to no pay, but the reality is you're not doing it for the money. You're doing it because you're passionate about firefighters' issues. You want to see those families that are being created from that firefighter family. One of the things that you'll notice about firefighters is most of them have families. They get married and have children, and that's because we're family people. That's the way we operate on the job and off the job. And so I just kind of fell in love with that. As a side note, I didn't know that was the thing when I became a firefighter. 23 years ago, I just became a firefighter because I wanted to be involved in my community. Then that pathway sort of presented itself, about maybe 11 years into my career.
That's an incredible answer, and kind of going back to the damage that these fires are taking a toll on neighborhoods in Oregon. What can you say about the air quality, and what's your advice for residents to stay as safe as possible?
Well, I've been monitoring the air quality since kind of the major shift that happened about a week ago, and it's even right outside my house. You walk outside and you're tasting it, you're smelling it, you could feel your throat, lumping up. It's because your body is telling you that you're breathing toxic air. Mm-hmm. And so I would say when you're listen to health officials when their recommendations are that you stay indoors, that if you have central air, turn it on, let it circulate inside your home because there's a filter in there that will clean it. You can replace that filter. Limit your exposure outside as much as necessary. Don't drive in some situations. Not only is you're breathing that toxic air that your car is not cleaning out, but you're also potentially in low visibility areas. So it's just not safe. And so those recommendations are ones that I would echo as well in the Oregon State Firefighters Council as well, because until we see the air getting better, which looks like we're going to get some rain in the forecast come about a day or two, that's going to help clean the air out, and we'll start to be able to go kind of back to our normal under the premise that we're in a global pandemic and people must, of course, keep up social distancing and wearing masks.
Hey, even the smoke traveled across the country. I was driving to school this week, and the sun was literally red here in New York. But yeah, in terms of that poor air quality, could that lead to damaging health effects in the future for people?
Absolutely. And I'm not a expert in that field, but I do have friends that live in New York, and they back from there as well. And I couldn't believe to see that smoke had traveled across the country, and now people are dealing with that across the country, that smoke. And so I would just monitor what is the air quality outside. And, if it's not safe, don't expose yourself to something like that, because you're essentially either removing years off of your life or potentially giving yourself health risks that you're going to have to deal with at some point later in life that your body won't be able to recover from potentially. So I would just make sure that people stay indoors as much as possible. And again, I mean, we're doing this as my family here at home. It's we're anxious to get out. We're anxious to get back outside, and especially as the weather's nice during the summer. But the reality is we just want to be safe and we want to be healthy. So we're going to endure this while we have to.
And could colder weather be a solution to all of this?
Certainly. I think what we really want to see here is wetter weather. When the rain comes in, those will be what ultimately extinguishes these fires. They're so massive, like you said in the beginning. We're talking about 1 million acres. It's over 15 square miles of burning forests and homes. So it's not, firefighters aren't going to go through that piece by piece and put that out. We need the weather to come in and do its part too. Now, our job is to contain it. Of course, our first job is to evacuate those areas that are threatened. But since we've seen a change in the wind, that evacuation zones have reduced, and many of the large fires we have here in Oregon. But ultimately, the weather needs to change, and we need wetter weather. Fortunately for us, we live in Oregon, so it does rain a lot. Not necessarily in the high desert, but it does in the valley and in these mountain ranges where these fires are occurring. So when those weather systems come through, that's going to be a well-needed assistant firefighters on the front line.
And Oregon Governor Khait Brown has been advocating for more funding to help wildfires. What's your thoughts on her response to this crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. Governor Brown has done a great job with the resources that she has, but the fact of the matter is, there just wasn't enough firefighters in Oregon at the time of these fires. And unfortunately, we had fires in Oregon. While in Oregon, we also had them in California and in Washington. So you've got firefighters up and down the West Coast that can't send aid necessarily because they're dealing with fires in their own states. However, we did have resources come in from Utah and I believe some from Wyoming and Nevada. So those were able to come and help us with different tasks, not only firefighting, but also searching the remains, looking for people who may have perished during the fire. And that's a very difficult task to go through and do. You can see how not only is it traumatic for firefighters to go through and do those tasks, the devastation in these areas. So while we definitely applaud Governor Brown in trying to increase funding, we want to make sure that for our sakes, we understand that success is firefighters. And that means hiring the number of firefighters that we need here in Oregon to protect the citizens that live here. We definitely support that.
Has your team been in communication with firefighters in other states like California to kind of strategize?
Well, I can't speak to that in my role specifically, but I think on a global level, I think it makes perfect sense. I mean, there's a lot of similarities to watch from Washington State, Oregon, and in California. We have a lot of similarities in some of how we have kind of coastal cities, coastal towns. We have sort of the valley off of the coast, and then we have the mountain range that comes from the volcanic mountain range that exists in what we call the Cascades in Oregon. But there's a lot of similarities between our three states, and we certainly need to be in lockstep. Anything needs to be kind of done together, but that's way above me. That's really at more of a policy level.
It's a great answer. And finally, what's your message for climate change deniers? Well, again,
As a firefighter, all I can do is go and respond when the bell goes off, and that's exactly what we've done in this case. While I understand that there are people who may or may not believe in climate change, I can only speak for myself when I say it certainly seems like things are getting worse.
All right, Vice President Isaac McLennan, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Your insight was incredibly valuable for our audience at WRHU.
Hey, thank you so much for this time, and thank you for doing this interview.
Thanks again to Rachel for that report. Joe Biden and Donald Trump are at odds again, this time on the topic of climate change. In a recent visit to California, the president told climate change expert Wade Crowfoot of California's Natural Resource Agency that global warming will somehow reverse itself, saying it will start to get cooler and that he didn't believe science knew anything.
In response, Biden told an audience at his recent Delaware event, if we have 4 more years of Trump's climate denial, many suburbs will be burned in wildfires. A recent NPR PBS Marist College poll found 84% of suburbities generally trusted public health experts to provide accurate information on the coronavirus, considerably more than people living in other areas. Biden went on to link Trump's anti-climate change ideology with his recent response to COVID-19. Biden told his audience, we are not safe in Donald Trump's America.
Last year, the president told the Washington Post that he does not believe in climate change. Yet his administration's National Climate Assessment warned in 2018 that there will be more frequent and intense weather and the climate-related weather conditions will damage infrastructure, economies, and social systems. Biden, on the other hand, has posed a Green New Deal in his campaign's website to address climate change. Part of his plan is to zero 100% clean energy economy, and zero net emissions by 2050.
Laws to protect the environment and climate are the focus of a new department at Columbia University Law School. WRHU reporter Rebecca Canfield interviewed Professor Michael Gerard of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. Professor Gerard discusses how laws taking shape could help the California wildfires today and in the future.
I'm Rebecca Canfield reporting for WRHU News, joined today by Professor Michael Gerard, who is the founder and faculty director of the groundbreaking Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University. Thank you so much for joining today.
My pleasure.
All right, so to get right into it, can you tell me about some of the exciting work that your department is doing at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law?
Well, one of the things we are doing is we have a project on legal pathways to deep decarbonization. How does the U.S. law, federal, state, and local, need to change in order for the U.S. to move away from fossil fuels and drastically reduce its greenhouse gas emissions? So we've produced a very large book, about a 1,200-page book that we edited together with others on the subject, and we now have a project recruiting pro bono law firms to draft the model laws that are recommended by the book. So that's one of our major projects.
Great. Looking into the California fires, what is the work that you guys have been doing or discussing based on those?
Well, we've certainly been talking about the effect that climate change has had on the fires. Climate change worsens the incidence and severity of fires, and there are a number of things that could be done at the local level that would reduce the fires, and then of course globally reducing greenhouse gas emissions is a major contributor.
So as you know, there have been major cuts to climate change laws and policies. Do you think that these cuts will affect the responses to the California wildfires?
Well, I wouldn't say in the short term necessarily, unless President Trump actually cuts off funding to California or something like that. But although that's been threatened, it hasn't happened yet. It's more of a long-term situation with the overall level of greenhouse gases, and then some issues with forest management. Most of the forested area in California is owned by the federal government, so it's really their responsibility for how to manage it. But on the short term, I don't think that those have much effect on what's happening now.
Right.
I will let me make one exception, which is that one of the effects of the wildfires is spreading smoke all across the continent, really, increasing levels of PM 2.5 in the air, and people who have COVID are especially hurt by the levels of this material that gets into lungs that are already struggling. And of course, in my view, the Trump administration does bear considerable responsibility for the United States government's mishandling of COVID. So that is one relationship that is immediate.
And talking a little bit more about government officials and their responses, we've seen that the fire season is still beginning, and 2020 has already shattered the all-time record with 3.2 million acres being burned so far. Again, with the government response, what are some of the things that government officials can do to change these numbers?
So I mentioned forest management, that it is important to have the practice of controlled burns, which remove the underbrush from the forest, and mean that when the forest, when a fire happens, it's less severe. These were methods that the Native Americans have been using for thousands of years. When homes are built right by the forest at the wildland-urban interface, it's harder to do these controlled burns, because if they take the wrong direction, they'll go to the houses. One of the major issues is too much allowance of construction at the forest edge. So that's one issue. Another issue is building codes. Building codes have been developed, but not everywhere adopted, to have fire-resistant building construction and materials, and to for single-family homes to have enough of a perimeter around the home so that the fire doesn't so easily jump. Emergency preparedness is another very important issue, so that there is, when a fire does happen, we have the emergency equipment, we have the emergency plans in place.
And even with some of the fire preparedness that's already being put in place, we are seeing more homes being destroyed as California's wildfires are building in these fire-prone areas. What are laws that can be set in place to change that?
Well, largely what I mentioned in terms of restrictions on building at the edge of the forest is the single most important thing that can be done together with the building codes.
Right. And then just shifting gears a little bit, your center has developed the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund and created the Silencing Science Tracker. Can you explain a little bit what that is and what its importance is today?
So for quite a few years, some climate scientists have been under attack, legal attack, by deniers of climate science. So the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund was set up to help provide pro bono legal representation and advice to these climate scientists. After President Trump was inaugurated, it became clear that one of the things his administration was doing was denying science, not only on climate change, but also on many other things. So on the first anniversary of his inauguration, we set up a database called the Silencing Science Tracker that attempts to keep track of reported instances in which the administration has squelched science or distorted it or tried to defund it or get rid of the scientists, to do all of these things that really get in the way of developing and utilizing good science.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That'll do it for our special coverage of the recent California wildfires. Continue tuning into Newsline this week for further updates on the fires. Our engineers this evening are John Sanelli and Shana Senkop.
Thank you for listening and watching our three-time Marconi Award-winning radio station, 88.7 FM, WRHU.
This has been a WRHU special broadcast. I'm Danielle Koscik.
And I'm Max Sacco. Thanks for listening and stay safe, Long Island.